All right, so in this video, we're going to start our next big topic in time period 3, and we're going to start looking at the political effects of industrialization. So we're going to be stuck on the political effects for quite a bit. So the political effects of industrialization. So these are all of the different political ideologies and reforms and political revolutions of the 19th century. So we're going to be stuck here for a little bit. The first political ideology that we have to look at is conservatism. And that's what we're going to look at in this video. So, unlike the other ideologies, conservatism is more of a reflection of the French Revolution than it is the Industrial Revolution. And that kind of makes sense in that conservatism tries to look back rather than rushing forward. So, in that sense, conservatism is kind of reactionary. It's trying to react to stuff that's already happened rather than being proactive and trying to be ready for the next thing. So reactionary means that it's reacting to past events rather than dealing with current ones. And so when we look at conservatism, we are going to be looking back at the French Revolution to an extent. So just like Enlightenment philosophers influenced the French Revolution, conservative philosophers influenced the period after. And the guy that we need to pay attention to here is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is the most important conservative philosopher. Burke argues that change and progress are natural, but need to happen slowly. And gradually. So, for instance, Burke will talk about the American Revolution and the French Revolution and use them to argue what he's talking about here. He would say that the American Revolution, which is an example of change, was natural. The American Revolution was natural. The US and the UK were growing apart and eventually would have separated. That was natural. It was natural that that happened. On the other hand, the French Revolution was unnatural. The French Revolution was unnatural. There was no lead up to it. There was no precedent for it. And it radically changed what was already there. So, two revolutions, but two different mindsets. The American Revolution was the culmination of something that was going to happen anyway. The French Revolution was something that was not going to happen necessarily. And if it were to happen, it wouldn't have happened the way that it did. And so what Burke is arguing is that revolutions like this are fine. Revolutions like this are bad. And that philosophy is going to guide the ideas of conservatism. So now, let's go back to the political scene at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So after Napoleon was defeated, the four main allies, and so we're talking here about Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the United Kingdom, met in Vienna, the capital of Austria, to figure out what to do next. And this meeting, a really important meeting in European history, becomes known as the Congress of Vienna. And this happened in 1815. And the Congress of Vienna was led, the guy running the meeting, by the Austrian foreign minister, Clemens von Metternich. So Metternich, more than anyone else in European history, he embodies conservatism. Like when you think conservatism, the name that should come to mind is Metternich. So a little bit about Metternich before we move on. So a little bit of background on who this guy was before we look at what he did. So Metternich was the son of an Austrian ambassador and nobleman. So he was maybe not a top guy, but he was definitely a noble. He was well connected. He was rich. His job, so his dad's job, was as ambassador to the Austrian Netherlands. otherwise known to us as Belgium. So that was his job. And his son, Clemens, worked as his father's assistant and, I guess, heir. So he would eventually take over for his dad. But in 1794, France took over Belgium. So now they were both out of a job. The same year, in 1794, France also took the Metternich family land, which was kind of on the border with France, on the Austrian border with France. So pretty much overnight, the French revolutionaries took away Metternich's job and land. And it forced them to move back to Vienna to look for a new job, which the younger Metternich, Clemens von Metternich, did find. So Clemens found a new job as ambassador to Prussia. And then soon after, he was named foreign minister at a really young age, like in his mid-30s. And he's going to hold this job until 1848. So he's going to be in charge of Austria's foreign policy for almost 30 years. Or more than 30 years. So, anyway, let's go back to the story of the Congress of Vienna. So that was just a little bit of background to show you why Metternich is so conservative. Because he views revolution as evil. It cost him everything, and he had to rebuild from the ground up. So for him, conservatism equals no revolutions and no nationalism. That's what drove the French Revolution, and he wants to make sure that doesn't happen again. So for him, conservatism means this, and he's going to make sure that that's what happens. So, moving on, the goal of the Congress of Vienna was to keep Europe stable. because Europe had been fighting for almost 25 years. And now Europe was finally peaceful again, and Metternich and really everybody wanted to keep it that way. So the goal of the Congress of Vienna was to keep Europe stable and peaceful. That was the goal. We want to maintain this peaceful status quo. That's what we want to do. Now, this is easier said than done because each of the four powers have their own goals and they have their own interests. So they all agree that war is bad and should only be done when necessary. The question is, what does necessary mean? So, to the British, going to war when it was necessary meant that the United Kingdom was threatened by a war. For the British to go back to war, it meant that Great Britain itself was in danger of a war. On the other hand, to Russia, necessary meant some writers in France, for instance, said the French Revolution had some good ideas. Like, to Russia, any kind of hint of revolution or nationalism was enough to go to war. And so Metternich had to balance all of these different interests in order to keep Europe stable. That was Metternich's big goal for this. Keep these interests balanced. The other big question that needed to be answered at the Congress of Vienna was this. What are we going to do with France? And again, Metternich was dealing with two very different opinions. on the one hand, he needed to punish France. That was the one thing he had to balance. Versus keeping France around to balance the British and maybe the Prussians. So we need to punish them, but we can't punish them too much that they're not around to balance the British and the Prussians. Europe needs a strong France. So what Metternich does, Metternich invites the French foreign minister, who is a really fascinating figure, but we don't really have time to talk about him. His name is Talleyrand, to the negotiations. To speak for France and all the minor powers of Europe. And in this way, Talleyrand and Metternich were able to negotiate a smaller France that was, I guess, hobbled by punishments but not killed. So there was a big debt that France had to pay. They had to shrink their military. They had to give up some territory. But in the end, France was left alive, weakened, but still relatively strong. At the end of the meeting, the major powers decided to meet every 3 to 5 years to discuss new events and work on the two alliances developed at the Congress of Vienna. This system is called the Concert of Europe. And it worked. It prevented major conflicts in Europe until 1853 and the outbreak of the Crimean War. So for roughly about 40 years, Europe was relatively peaceful, and that was a a long time considering that Europe had just had 25 years of almost constant war. And it did what it was supposed to do. There were meetings about every 5 years. And they would be held in other cities in the alliance. So, what were these two alliances? The first one is the backbone of the Concert of Europe. So, the first alliance is called the Quadruple Alliance. And then later, when France is added, it becomes the Quintuple Alliance. And its purpose was Metternich's purpose. It was meant to keep revolution and nationalism from emerging, because those things lead to instability. Now, a question emerges. What about a domestic issue? Like, what about a purely domestic rebellion? Would we go to war over that? The British say absolutely not. The Russians, on the other end of the spectrum, say absolutely. The other members of the alliance kind of figure these things out on a case-by-case basis. Britain will stay out of things almost entirely. The Russians will fight to get into these things first. Everyone else kind of plays it by ear. The other alliance is called the Holy Alliance. And the Holy Alliance was between the three emperors. You've got the Tsar Alexander, the Austrian Emperor, and the King of Prussia. So I guess not three emperors. Two emperors and a king. The British looked at this and they're like, no, we don't want any part of this. This is all a bunch of mumbo jumbo stuff and we're out. We'll stay in the Quadruple Alliance, but we don't want anything to do with this. So what the Holy Alliance was this idea of the czars. The Tsar had gotten really into like spiritual Christianity. And he got it into his head that things like love and justice would save the world, and the kings of Europe would ensure that this happened. And the very pragmatic British looked at this and they said, this doesn't mean anything, we're out. But the Tsar and the Austrian Emperor were close, and they agreed to this, and the King of Prussia signed on to it as well. Now, Metternich was like the British. He was like, this is meaningless. This doesn't serve any purpose. But then Metternich had an idea. He needed to keep the Tsar on board with everything. So he couldn't just dismiss the Tsar's beliefs. So what Metternich did, Metternich rewrote the treaty to make the enemies of love and justice to be nationalism and progress and Enlightenment ideas. And so, in that sense, he turned what was just a simple agreement between Christian emperors into something that he could use to reinforce the other alliance. So, we're going to stop there. And in our next video, we're going to look at how this was put into practice. So we've got the basic foundations of conservatism. Now what we want to do is look at how conservatism was used. How did somebody like Metternich use these principles to help maintain order? And we'll look at that in our next video. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.